The year was 1162, and in the frozen wastes of Mongolia, a child was born who would reshape the very fabric of human civilization, not through philosophy or religion, but through something far more primal and terrifying. His name was Temujin, though history would remember him by another title, Genghis Khan. But this isn't the story you learned in school about military conquests and trade routes. This is about something darker, more systematic, and infinitely more disturbing. A campaign of sexual violence so organized, so methodical, that it transformed reproduction itself into a weapon of empire. Today, we're going to examine the horrifying truth behind one of history's most successful conquerors. How a single man engineered a system that turned women into inventory, children into political assets, and entire bloodlines into instruments of permanent domination. This isn't just about ancient history. The genetic evidence is still with us today, written into the DNA of millions across the globe. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand conquest, power, and the true cost of empire building. But before we dive into the systematic horrors that would follow, we need to understand the mind that conceived them. Young Temujin's world was brutal even by medieval standards. When he was barely 9 years old, his father was murdered by rival tribesmen, leaving his family destitute and vulnerable. His mother struggled to feed her children on scraps and whatever the harsh steppes would provide. For Temujin, survival meant learning a harsh lesson early. The world was divided into those who take and those who have everything taken from them. The defining moment came when he was 16. His promised bride, Berta, was kidnapped by enemy warriors. For months, Temujin searched desperately, haunted by what might be happening to her. When he finally rescued her, she was alive but pregnant. The child she carried could have been his or her captors. Nobody would ever know. That night, something crystallized in the young warrior's mind. A cold, calculating realization that would eventually reshape continents. Women weren't just casualties of war. They were the future itself, and whoever controlled that future controlled everything. This insight would prove far more devastating than any sword or siege engine ever could be. While other conquerors focused on capturing cities and treasure, Temujin began to understand that true power lay in controlling reproduction. Kill a generation of warriors, and the enemy might rebuild in 20 years, but capture their women, impregnate them with your offspring, and their children would grow up knowing who their real masters were. It wasn't just conquest. It was biological transformation on a scale never before attempted. By 1206, when the Mongol tribes proclaimed him Genghis Khan, his vision had already begun taking shape. What emerged wasn't random violence or opportunistic assault. It was something far more chilling, an industrial system for processing human beings. His administrators developed protocols that read like a nightmare version of modern logistics. Every captured woman would be catalogued, classified, and assigned a role in what they called permanent seeding. The first large-scale implementation came during the campaign against the Tangut kingdom in 1209. The Mongols didn't just attack like savage raiders, they advanced with the precision of a machine. Alongside the warriors rode scribes, record keepers, and physicians specifically trained in female anatomy. Weeks before any siege began, spies infiltrated target cities to conduct secret censuses. How many women? What ages? Which family lines? Every detail was recorded on scrolls that became the first industrial documentation of systematic sexual violence in human history. When cities fell, the sorting began immediately. Men were typically executed or enslaved, but women faced something far more calculated. They were divided into categories with surgical precision. Primary reproducers, ages 14 to 30, with no visible defects. Secondary reproducers, 31 to 40, preferably those who had already proven their fertility. The third category, those under 14, over 40, or showing signs of illness, simply disappeared. The first two groups were branded with ink marks on their wrists and loaded into specially designed caravans that followed the army like a shadow. These caravans were unlike anything the world had ever seen. Rolling cages engineered specifically for human processing. Different compartments separated the newly captured from those already pregnant. One wagon carried women who had recently given birth. Another confined those deemed unproductive, awaiting gradual elimination. Mongol physicians traveled with these caravans, experimenting with herbs to increase ovulation rates, dietary supplements to boost fertility, and even crude surgical procedures to address reproductive problems. The women had ceased being people. They had become breeding stock in the most literal sense. The bureaucracy was relentless and thorough. Every violation was documented, every pregnancy tracked, every birth classified according to the infant's potential value to the empire. Promising babies with sufficiently Mongol features were separated from their mothers and raised as true Mongols. Those who didn't meet the standards were quietly eliminated. Women lost their names the moment they were captured. From that point forward, they existed only as numbers tattooed into their flesh, identification codes that included their tribal origin, reproductive history, and estimated value to the system. Some tried to preserve fragments of their former identities. They whispered their real names to newborn children, hoping the sounds might somehow survive. Others carved marks into their own skin to remember who they had once been. But the system was designed to crush such resistance with terrifying efficiency. Within a single generation, these women had been reduced to shadows of their former selves, existing only to serve the empire's biological expansion. By 1211, when Genghis Khan turned his attention to the Jin Empire of northern China, the machinery had been perfected through years of practice and refinement. The Mongols were no longer simply conquering territories, they were conquering wombs. In one campaign alone, they seized the city of Zhongdu, capturing more than 40,000 women of reproductive age. By 1213, records indicate over 100,000 women were moving in caravans that stretched for miles behind the main Mongol army. The process had become truly industrial in scale and scope. Capture, classify, condition, violate, impregnate, monitor the pregnancy, oversee the birth, then reassign or eliminate based on the results. Even the babies born into this nightmare faced their own systematic sorting. Those with features deemed sufficiently Mongol were removed from their mothers immediately and integrated into Mongol households. The rest were disposed of at birth with bureaucratic efficiency. The system had protocols for everything, including resistance. Women who refused to eat were force-fed until their will broke completely. Those who attempted to induce abortions were shackled under constant surveillance. Women who tried to mutilate themselves to become barren were kept alive just long enough to serve as public warnings to others. Most heartbreaking of all, mothers who killed their own newborns to deny them to the empire faced public torture, designed to ensure no other woman would follow their example. This wasn't warfare as the world had known it. This was biological conquest on an unprecedented scale. Genghis Khan had realized that temporary military victory was insufficient for true dominance. Territories could rebel or be reclaimed by future generations. But if you could alter the very genetics of conquered populations, your victory became permanent. Each pregnant captive represented a seed of conquest planted in the future, growing into a living monument to Mongol supremacy. The scale continued expanding at an almost incomprehensible rate. By 1220, caravans containing more than 200,000 women stretched across the steppes from Mongolia to Eastern Europe. The empire had constructed an entire logistical network dedicated to managing this human cargo. Supply stations were established to inspect what they called reproductive units. Field hospitals were built specifically for forced births. Sorting centers operated where each newborn's fate was decided according to imperial standards. The true horror wasn't just in the violence itself. The though that was beyond comprehension. It was in how systematized everything had become. Every act of brutality was catalogued like livestock management. Every woman was reduced to statistical data. Every child was evaluated against standardized imperial criteria. This was conquest transformed into bureaucracy, evil refined into administrative efficiency. Yet even within this nightmare system, the human spirit found ways to resist. The women trapped in these caravans developed their own secret networks of communication. They created coded gestures to share crucial information about potential escape routes, methods for inducing miscarriages, and even techniques for poisoning their own breast milk to kill infants without detection. Some deliberately starved themselves until pregnancies became less likely. Others infected their own wounds to trigger fevers that threatened both themselves and their unborn children. But perhaps the most poignant form of resistance was emotional and cultural. These women created rituals to preserve memory despite the system's attempts to erase their identities. They maintained soft chants in languages the Mongols couldn't understand. They composed songs that carried through the night air of the steppes. They repeated the names of lost children over and over, ensuring these identities wouldn't vanish entirely from the world. Even as their bodies were systematically broken, they fought to preserve something of their humanity and the cultures they represented. The women understood that death was inevitable for most of them, yet they transformed survival itself into a form of victory. Not physical survival, which was largely beyond their control, but the survival of memory, culture, and human dignity. These acts of resistance never appeared in official Mongol records because they were too small and too human to be captured by bureaucratic documentation. But they were real, and they represented the unbreakable core of human resistance to dehumanization, humanization. By 1219, the machinery of human exploitation had reached a level of refinement that defied comprehension. When Genghis Khan unleashed his forces against the Khwarezmid Empire, he brought with him not merely an army, but a perfected system of biological warfare. The Mongols no longer improvised their approach to human harvesting. Every aspect had been codified, systematized, and optimized through years of brutal experimentation. Intelligence networks now operated months ahead of the main force, gathering detailed information about target populations. They catalogued not just the number of women in each city, but their family connections, their skills, and their emotional vulnerabilities. All of this data was weaponized to break resistance more efficiently and maximize compliance rates among the captured. The great cities of Central Asia fell like dominoes before this perfected machine. Bukhara, Samarkand, and Merv collapsed not just to military might, but to an industrial process of human separation that had been refined to devastating effectiveness. Families were torn apart with clinical precision, following protocols that the Mongols had developed through years of practice. They had learned that keeping mothers with young children for exactly 3 months made them more cooperative initially. But after that crucial period, separation became the key to shattering resistance permanently. Social hierarchies were exploited with calculating cruelty. Noble women received special attention, not from any sense of mercy, but because their treatment served specific strategic purposes. They were reserved for high-ranking Mongol officers and provided with marginally better conditions. The reasoning was coldly practical. Aristocratic women often possessed refined physical features that could be more easily integrated into Mongol elite society. Their offspring would carry genetic markers that made assimilation into the upper ranks of the empire more seamless. Peasant women, by contrast, were processed in massive groups with assembly line efficiency. Their value lay not in refinement, but in raw endurance, the ability to survive pregnancy under brutal conditions and produce physically robust children who could serve the empire's expanding needs. The Mongols had essentially created different production lines for different types of human output, each optimized for specific imperial requirements. The medical experimentation reached truly horrifying levels during this period. Mongol physicians, working with the systematic brutality of researchers, pushed their knowledge of female reproduction to unprecedented extremes. They experimented with herbal compounds designed to trigger multiple ovulations, hoping to increase the likelihood of twins or triplets from each pregnancy. They monitored the earliest signs of conception with obsessive attention to detail, adjusting diets and living conditions to minimize complications that might reduce productivity. Everything was calibrated toward a single, terrifying objective: transforming every captured womb into a factory of imperial expansion. The physicians kept meticulous records of their experiments, documenting which treatments produced the highest pregnancy rates, which diets led to the healthiest births, and which psychological conditioning methods proved most effective at breaking resistance while maintaining reproductive function. By 1220, the scope had expanded beyond anything the ancient world had ever witnessed. Contemporary accounts describe caravans of women that stretched for days of travel, moving across the landscape like a secondary shadow army. These weren't chaotic groups of captives, but highly organized divisions with specialized functions and strict hierarchical structures. Each caravan contained multiple specialized sections. There were intake divisions for newly captured women, classification units for sorting by reproductive potential, conditioning sections for breaking psychological resistance, pregnancy monitoring divisions, birthing facilities, infant processing centers, and finally, reassignment or elimination units. Every section had its own administrators, medical personnel, guards, and carefully developed protocols for maximum efficiency. The caravans functioned like mobile cities of systematic horror. They included wagons that served as mobile hospitals, specialized tents for women in different stages of pregnancy, and even dedicated disposal wagons for managing the constant stream of deaths. It was an empire built not just on conquest, but on the industrialized processing of human lives at a scale that wouldn't be seen again until the 20th century. But the true genius of Genghis Khan's system lay not in its immediate efficiency, but in its designed permanence. Unlike other conquerors who focused on temporary dominance, he understood that genetic conquest was eternal. Territory could be reclaimed, treasure could be stolen back, but bloodlines were forever. Each child born within the system carried Mongol genetic markers, and those children would reproduce, spreading the conquest deeper into future generations with each passing decade. Modern genetic analysis has confirmed this strategy's devastating effectiveness. Scientific studies of Y chromosome distribution reveal that approximately 16 million men alive today carry genetic markers directly traceable to Genghis Khan and his immediate male relatives. That represents roughly 1 in every 200 men currently living on Earth. In Mongolia itself, nearly 8% of the male population bears this genetic signature. Across Central Asia, the percentage hovers around 3%, while even in Eastern Europe, far from the Mongol heartland, the genetic markers persist in measurable quantities. These numbers represent more than statistical curiosities. They document the most successful biological conquest in recorded history. Behind each genetic marker lies a woman who was captured, catalogued, and forced to bear children for the empire. Behind each percentage point lies a culture that was fractured, families that were destroyed, and identities that were systematically erased. The system wasn't limited to Genghis Khan himself. His sons, grandsons, and trusted generals all participated in and expanded the methodology. Ogedei Khan refined the techniques during the European campaigns. Mungke Khan applied them extensively throughout the Middle East. Kublai Khan integrated them into the governance structure of Yuan dynasty China. What had begun as a military tactic evolved into imperial doctrine, passed down through generations as standard dynastic procedure. By the time of Genghis Khan's death in 1227, the caravans of captive women stretched for thousands of miles across Eurasia, like a vast network of human suffering. His passing didn't end the system, but rather institutionalized it further. His heirs treated the caravans as part of their inheritance, dividing women among themselves like any other form of valuable property. The children born within this nightmare were raised with their origins carefully obscured, their futures predetermined by imperial needs. They became living weapons in the ongoing biological conquest, carrying Mongol genes into populations that would never fully recover their original genetic composition. The system had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the transformation of reproduction itself into a permanent instrument of political domination. The funeral ceremonies that marked Genghis Khan's death revealed the system's ultimate brutality. While 40 young women were buried alive with his body as ritual offerings, thousands more were executed to prevent potential uprisings during the political transition. Their bodies were disposed of in mass graves, organized with the same bureaucratic precision that had defined their captivity. These weren't spontaneous acts of violence, but calculated policy decisions designed to maintain imperial stability. Archaeological evidence discovered centuries later confirms the systematic nature of these executions. Excavations across Central Asia have revealed mass burial sites containing the remains of young women, often separated from male burials and showing clear signs of violent death. The skeletons bear evidence of chronic malnutrition, untreated injuries from forced marches, and the physical toll of repeated pregnancies under brutal conditions. In one particularly haunting discovery near ancient Bukhara, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a woman and teenage girl buried together. DNA analysis revealed they were mother and daughter. While the mother had lived her entire life in that region, isotope analysis of the daughter's bones showed she had traveled vast distances before her death, likely dragged across the empire in one of the caravans before ultimately perishing in the same soil that held her mother's remains. These silent witnesses in the earth provide final proof of the system's reality and scope. The Mongol Empire had indeed constructed an apparatus for biological conquest that operated with industrial efficiency across multiple continents. It was a machine that consumed human lives and transformed them into genetic conquest, leaving scars not just on landscapes and monuments, but in the very DNA of populations across Eurasia. The system's success can be measured not just in territory controlled or battles won, but in the permanent alteration of human genetic diversity across vast regions of the world. Genghis Khan had achieved something no other conqueror in history had managed: victory that outlasted empires, outlasted dynasties, outlasted even the memory of the conquest itself. His triumph was written not in stone or bronze, but in the chromosomes of millions who would never know the true origin of their bloodlines. The horror of this system wasn't merely its scale, but the calculated psychology behind its design. Genghis Khan had understood something that would elude military strategists for centuries. The most effective conquest wasn't of cities or armies, but of hope itself. The women trapped within these caravans weren't just physically imprisoned. They were psychologically dismantled through methods so sophisticated they wouldn't be replicated until the darkest chapters of the 20th century. The Mongols had developed what modern psychologists would recognize as systematic trauma bonding. Newly captured women were subjected to carefully orchestrated cycles of brutality, followed by minor mercies. A beating might be followed by an extra portion of food. Separation from children might be temporarily reversed as a reward for compliance. These calculated gestures weren't acts of kindness, but psychological manipulation designed to create dependence and crush the will to resist. The most insidious aspect was how the system corrupted the captured women's relationships with each other. The Mongols deliberately created hierarchies within the caravans, offering slightly better treatment to those who helped maintain order among their fellow captives. Some women were given supervisory roles over others, creating divisions that prevented unified resistance. The empire had weaponized survival instinct itself, turning victims against each other in ways that would echo through generations. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic erasure of cultural identity. The The Mongols didn't simply want bodies for reproduction. They wanted to eliminate the cultural frameworks that might allow conquered peoples to maintain distinct identities. Women were forbidden from teaching their native languages to their children. Traditional songs, stories, and customs were punished with increasingly severe consequences. The goal wasn't just genetic conquest, but cultural annihilation on a scale that defied comprehension. Religious practices faced particular persecution. The Mongols understood that faith often provided the psychological strength needed for resistance. Women caught performing traditional rituals faced public torture designed to terrorize others. Sacred objects were destroyed in elaborate ceremonies that forced the captives to watch their spiritual foundations being systematically dismantled. The message was clear. Not only had their bodies been conquered, but their souls belonged to the empire as well. The children born within this system faced their own unique horrors. Those deemed sufficiently Mongol in appearance were removed from their mothers within days of birth, ensuring no emotional bonds could form that might compromise their loyalty to the empire. They were raised in specialized facilities where their origins were never discussed, their biological mothers erased from their personal histories. These children grew up believing themselves to be true Mongols, never knowing they were living weapons in an ongoing campaign of genetic warfare. The ones who didn't meet the physical standards faced immediate elimination, but even this was systematized with chilling efficiency. Mongol administrators had developed criteria for infant evaluation that read like livestock breeding manuals. Skull measurements, limb proportions, skin coloration, even the shape of eyes were assessed according to standardized charts. Those who failed inspection were disposed of through methods designed to minimize disruption to the caravan's operations. The psychological impact on mothers forced to watch this process was devastating and deliberate. The Mongols understood that breaking a woman's spirit required destroying her most fundamental biological imperative, protecting her offspring. By making mothers complicit in this evaluation process, forcing them to present their newborns for inspection, the system achieved levels of psychological destruction that went far beyond physical abuse. Records from this period, written in the clinical language of imperial administration, document the systematic nature of these practices with terrifying precision. Mongol bureaucrats tracked pregnancy rates, birth outcomes, and infant survival with the same attention to detail they applied to military supplies or livestock management. Women weren't even afforded the dignity of being considered human in these documents. They were referred to as reproductive assets, breeding stock, or simply units of production. The medical experimentation reached truly horrifying extremes during the later campaigns. Mongol physicians began attempting surgical procedures to increase fertility rates, often without any anesthetic or proper sanitation. They experimented with hormonal manipulation using crude herbal compounds, frequently resulting in painful complications that were simply accepted as operational costs. The most disturbing experiments involved attempts to accelerate pregnancies, reasoning that faster reproduction cycles would increase overall output. These medical horrors were documented with the same bureaucratic precision that characterized every aspect of the system. Mongol physicians kept detailed records of their experiments, noting which procedures produced the highest success rates and which caused too many deaths to be cost-effective. The language in these records is so clinical, so detached from human suffering, that reading them today produces a sense of vertigo at the sheer banality of evil. The caravans themselves evolved into mobile laboratories of human experimentation. Different sections tested various approaches to maximizing reproductive efficiency. Some focused on nutritional manipulation, others on psychological conditioning. The most horrifying sections experimented with genetic selection, attempting to breed for specific physical traits that would make the resulting children more valuable to the empire. By the 1220s, the system had achieved such refinement that it operated with the efficiency of a modern industrial complex. Processing centers could handle thousands of women simultaneously, sorting them according to dozens of criteria with assembly line precision. The Mongols had essentially created the world's first industrial-scale human trafficking operation, complete with standardized procedures, quality control measures, and productivity targets. The geographic scope continued expanding as Mongol armies pushed into new territories. Each conquered region brought fresh populations to feed into the machinery of biological conquest. The system adapted to local conditions with remarkable flexibility, developing specialized approaches for different cultures and ethnic groups. What worked with Chinese populations was modified for Persian women, then further refined for European captives. The Mongols had learned that psychological breaking techniques needed to be culturally specific to achieve maximum effectiveness. Methods that destroyed the will of nomadic women might prove less effective against urban populations. Religious persecution strategies that worked in Buddhist regions required modification in Islamic territories. The empire had developed a sophisticated understanding of cultural psychology, all in service of more efficient human processing. The children produced by this system weren't just numerous, they were strategically distributed across the empire to maximize their impact on local populations. Mongol administrators carefully tracked bloodlines, ensuring that genetic markers were spread as widely as possible while maintaining concentrations in strategically important regions. This wasn't random reproduction, but calculated genetic colonization designed to permanently alter the demographic composition of conquered territories. The economic implications were staggering. The Mongol Empire had essentially created a human production system that generated both immediate labor and long-term genetic conquest simultaneously. Women in the caravans weren't just producing future Mongols, they were also providing immediate economic value through textile production, food preparation, and other essential services that supported the army's operations. This dual-purpose approach maximized the return on investment in human capital while minimizing the resources required to maintain the system. The caravans were largely self-sustaining, with older women training younger ones in essential skills, while pregnant women continued contributing labor until the moment of birth. Even the disposal of those deemed unproductive was managed to extract maximum value, with bodies used for medical experimentation or anatomical study. The psychological warfare aspects of the system extended beyond the immediate victims to terrorize entire populations. Word of the caravans spread ahead of Mongol armies, creating panic that often led to cities surrendering without resistance, rather than face the systematic horror that awaited their female populations. The mere knowledge that such a fate existed became a weapon of conquest in itself. Diplomatic records from various kingdoms showed desperate attempts to negotiate terms that would spare their women from this fate. Some rulers offered tribute payments specifically calculated to exceed the estimated value of their female populations. Others attempted to hide women in underground shelters or evacuate them to distant territories. But the Mongols had anticipated such strategies and developed countermeasures that made escape nearly impossible. The system's psychological impact wasn't limited to its immediate victims. Entire societies developed trauma responses that would persist for generations. Cultural practices around marriage, childbirth, and family structures were permanently altered in regions that experienced Mongol conquest. The fear of what had happened became embedded in collective memory, influencing social behaviors long after the immediate threat had passed. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities attempted to develop defensive strategies specifically designed to protect their women. Underground tunnel systems, hidden chambers, and elaborate escape routes have been discovered in regions that faced Mongol invasion. These desperate preparations reveal the terror that the caravan system inspired and the lengths to which people would go to avoid its horrors. The Mongol Empire had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the transformation of reproduction itself into a weapon of permanent conquest. This wasn't simply about controlling territory or extracting tribute. It was about fundamentally altering the genetic composition of entire civilizations, ensuring that Mongol dominance would persist in the very blood of conquered peoples long after political control had ended. The efficiency of this biological warfare exceeded anything achieved through conventional military means. While traditional conquest could be reversed through rebellion or foreign intervention, genetic conquest was irreversible. Each child born within the system represented a permanent victory that would replicate itself across future generations, spreading Mongol influence through bloodlines that would persist for millennia. Modern DNA analysis continues to reveal the staggering success of this strategy. The genetic markers associated with Genghis Khan and his lineage can be found today from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, representing the most successful reproductive strategy in recorded human history. Behind each of these genetic signatures lies a woman who was captured, processed, and forced to contribute to this biological conquest against her will. The true horror of Genghis Khan's system wasn't just its immediate brutality, but its designed permanence. He had created a form of conquest that would outlive empires, outlive dynasties, outlive even the memory of the conquest itself. His victory was written not in monuments or chronicles, but in the chromosomes of millions who would never know the true origin of their bloodlines or the price that had been paid in human suffering to create them. The ripple effects of this systematic horror extended far beyond the immediate victims, creating waves of terror that would reshape entire civilizations. As news of the caravans spread across trade routes and diplomatic channels, kingdoms thousands of miles from Mongol territory began altering their fundamental social structures in desperate attempts to protect their populations. The mere knowledge that such a fate existed became a weapon more powerful than any siege engine. In the courts of distant rulers, frantic discussions centered not on military defense, but on the impossible mathematics of human sacrifice. How many women could be hidden? How many could be evacuated? Some kingdoms developed elaborate early warning systems, networks of messengers whose sole purpose was to provide advance notice of approaching Mongol forces so that female populations could be moved to prepared hiding places. Others attempted to negotiate preemptive surrender terms that might spare their women from the caravans. But Genghis Khan had anticipated such desperate measures. His intelligence networks had evolved beyond simple military reconnaissance to become sophisticated systems for tracking human resources. Mongol spies didn't just map fortifications and troop movements. They conducted detailed censuses of female populations, noting ages, family connections, and potential hiding places. When armies arrived, they carried with them comprehensive lists of exactly what human assets each conquered territory was expected to yield. The psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. Cities that might have resisted for months against conventional siege tactics opened their gates immediately when faced with the prospect of systematic population processing. The Mongols had weaponized fear itself, creating a terror so specific and so well documented that mere rumors could accomplish what armies could not. The administrative machinery supporting these operations had grown into something resembling a modern corporation, complete with specialized departments and standardized procedures. Training facilities were established where Mongol personnel learned the most efficient methods for population sorting, transportation logistics, and reproductive monitoring. These weren't improvised skills developed on battlefields, but professional competencies taught through systematic instruction. The most chilling aspect was how thoroughly normalized the entire process had become within Mongol society. Children grew up seeing the caravans as simply another aspect of imperial administration, no different from tax collection or road maintenance. Young Mongol men were trained to view the processing of conquered women as both a privilege of victory and a duty to the empire. The system had created its own culture, its own values, and its own justifications. Records from Mongol administrative centers reveal the bureaucratic language used to discuss these operations. Women weren't referred to as captives or prisoners, but as acquired assets or reproductive resources. Pregnancies were recorded as production cycles, births were classified as output, deaths were noted as operational losses. This linguistic sanitization allowed administrators to discuss mass human suffering in the same tone they might use for livestock management or grain storage. The scale of documentation was staggering. Mongol bureaucrats maintained detailed records, not just of individual women, but of entire family lineages. They tracked genetic inheritance patterns, noting which combinations of parental traits produced offspring deemed most valuable to the empire. These records functioned as both administrative tools and scientific experiments, representing perhaps the earliest systematic attempt at human genetic manipulation. The medical knowledge accumulated through these operations advanced far beyond anything available to contemporary civilizations. Mongol physicians developed sophisticated understanding of reproductive biology, pregnancy management, and infant care through their systematic experimentation on captive populations. They created detailed charts correlating maternal nutrition with birth outcomes, developed techniques for managing difficult pregnancies, and established protocols for maximizing infant survival rates. This medical advancement came at an unspeakable human cost. The experimental subjects were women who had no choice in their participation and received no benefit from the knowledge gained through their suffering. The physicians conducting these experiments documented their findings with clinical detachment, noting success rates and optimal procedures, while remaining completely indifferent to the agony they inflicted. The children produced by this system faced their own unique form of psychological manipulation. Those selected for integration into Mongol society underwent systematic identity reconstruction designed to eliminate any connection to their original heritage. They were given new names, new family histories, and new cultural identities. Their biological mothers became non-persons, erased from official records, and forbidden from any contact with their offspring. These children grew up believing themselves to be legitimate members of Mongol society, never knowing they were living weapons in an ongoing campaign of genetic conquest. Many would eventually participate in further expansion of the system, processing new populations with the same bureaucratic efficiency their mothers had experienced. The cycle of conquest had become self-perpetuating, with each generation producing new administrators for the machinery of biological warfare. The geographic distribution of these children wasn't random, but followed carefully planned patterns designed to maximize their impact on local populations. Mongol administrators studied demographic compositions and cultural structures to determine optimal placement strategies. Children with certain physical characteristics were sent to regions where they could most effectively blend with local populations while still carrying Mongol genetic markers. The economic implications had grown beyond simple resource extraction to encompass fundamental alterations in regional demographics and labor structures. Areas subjected to intensive population processing experienced permanent changes in their social composition, with traditional family structures disrupted and entire communities restructured around the presence of Mongol offspring. Trade routes adapted to accommodate the massive logistical requirements of the caravan system. Supply stations were established at regular intervals, stocked with resources specifically needed for managing large populations of pregnant women and infants. These stations became permanent fixtures of the imperial infrastructure, creating economic dependencies that outlasted the military campaigns themselves. The cultural impact extended far beyond immediate conquest zones. Societies across Eurasia developed new forms of literature, art, and religious expression centered around themes of loss, separation, and survival. Epic poems emerged that told stories of women taken by distant armies. Religious practices evolved to include specific prayers for those lost to the caravans. These cultural adaptations represented collective attempts to process trauma on a civilizational scale. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal the systematic nature of these operations. Excavation sites across former Mongol territories show clear patterns of demographic disruption, with traditional burial practices interrupted and replaced by mass graves containing predominantly female remains. The archaeological record provides silent testimony to operations conducted with such thoroughness that they permanently altered the physical landscape of human settlement. The genetic evidence scattered across continents today tells the final chapter of this horrifying story. 16 million men carry the chromosomal signature of Genghis Khan's systematic campaign of biological conquest. Each DNA marker represents not just a statistical curiosity, but a woman whose name was erased, whose identity was catalogued, and whose body became an instrument of permanent empire. This wasn't merely the largest military conquest in history, it was the most successful biological warfare campaign ever executed, transforming human reproduction itself into a weapon that would outlive dynasties, outlive empires, and outlive memory itself. The true terror of Genghis Khan's legacy lies not in the cities he destroyed or the armies he defeated, but in the millions who walk among us today, carrying in their very DNA the evidence of history's most systematic campaign of sexual violence. His victory was written not in stone, but in blood, ensuring that his conquest would continue spreading through generations long after the last Mongol banner had fallen.